Hey guys, it's Aaron Gore from Fresh Pitch Beverage Consulting. Thank you to Andrew for having me on today. Doing something a little bit different than the typical Ask Me Anything. We're actually going to be doing a bit of a presentation alongside an Ask Me Anything, so it'll be open for questions pretty much the entire time. So if you guys have anything to say, anything you'd like to ask, please go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll be able to see it as we go. Can't promise I'm going to be able to answer all of them, but I will do my best. And if you feel like leaving any compliments in there as well, I'm pretty easy to flatter and or bribe. So today what we're going to be talking about is choosing new markets. So this is something that almost all of you have probably run into, especially as your business is growing. You reach the point where you realize that you really need to start entering into some new markets in order to continue that growth and in order to continue your success. So the question is, where to next? Now, that decision, alongside a lot of decisions in the craft beer world, unfortunately, tends to be made more intuitively or more based on your gut than on anything actually tangible or anything actually objective. And there are certain business decisions that you can make with your gut and they work out just fine. Something like, what's the next pilot batch we're going to brew, or what should we put on special next Thursday? Those are all low stakes. And at the end of the day, the amount of work that you would probably have to go ahead and do to make a strategic decision as opposed to one based on your gut is probably just not worthwhile. But something like choosing a whole new market for you to enter into with your business, the time, the energy, the costs, the opportunity that you give up doing so, those are things that you can't really get back. So it's important that you apply yourself and you put that time into making sure that you do it right. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today are going to seem a little bulky or seem like a lot of work, but I promise you they really aren't. Most of them are pretty quick to do. And at the end of the day, the benefit and the stakes involved are high enough that you owe it to yourself, to your business, and to your employees to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to make it as successful as possible. So when you are looking at new markets to enter, there's a few things that you have to keep in mind. And one of the biggest ones is taking a look at the size of the market, but not only the size of the market, also the size of the potential craft beer market within that market. Now, what do I mean by that? At the end of the day, the kind of people who are drinking craft beer are fundamentally different than the American average. They tend to be younger. The median age of a craft beer drinker is about 35. Now, on the other hand, the median age of the American workforce is about 44. That means that your average craft beer drinker is significantly younger than the average. So you can have a city that has a ton of people, but not necessarily a ton of people who are kind of in your target. Same thing goes for income. It's easy to forget that your average craft beer drinker is also pretty affluent. Typically coming from a household that makes over $100,000 a year. Now, for point of reference, the U.S. median income is about $65,000 a year. So we can easily forget, especially being as close to it as we are, and for a lot of people who this is a pretty heavy part of how we spend our time, energy, and money, craft beer is a luxury good. It's an affordable luxury good. It's a relatively cheap luxury good. But when someone is able to get a 30 rack of Bud Light for like $13 on discount, you definitely have to look at the fact that people are going to need a little bit of extra cash to throw around in order to buy it. So the things that we really need to look for, I call key market indicators, or KMIs if you're feeling nasty. So first and foremost, and the most important one to look at, is actually the population of a potential market that you'd be looking at. Now, this is a pretty easy one to find. And honestly, what we're trying to do here is figure out the size, not only of that market, but like I said, that craft beer market. And you can't really find that just off of a basic Google search. So what we're going to do is work off of some of these things that we can do a basic Google search and find. So population is important. And the reason that's important is that more people almost invariably means more potential opportunities to sell your product. You can have an entire town filled with craft beer drinkers. Everybody in Clinton, Massachusetts could be a craft beer drinker, but if the entire town only has about 13,000 people, that's still significantly less lucrative than, for example, Chicago, even if the proportion of people drinking craft beer is significantly different. But that population still is the key for deciding how many potential opportunities you have to sell your product. Now, it is important to look not just at the population of the city, but also the population of the metro area. Now, to give you an example, and I'm going to use Charlotte, North Carolina as an example for a few things today, mostly because I live there and I know most of the stats off the top of my head, but it's also a pretty good reference point for kind of a standard good size American city. So Charlotte, North Carolina has about 850,000 people living in it, as opposed to Atlanta, which has about 450,000 or about 500,000 people living in it. Now, if you're taking a look at just that, you'd be pretty forgiven for thinking that Charlotte's a significantly bigger market, almost twice as large. The difference is the Charlotte Metro has about 2.6 million people in it. The Atlanta Metro has about 6 million people living in it. So you can see how just by taking a look at that metro area, those numbers flip pretty significantly. Now, the people in that metro area, they're probably still driving into Atlanta or respectively Charlotte to do their drinking, to buy product, to visit breweries. They're still potential customers. More than that, some of your wholesalers are probably servicing those metro areas as well. So it's important to really take those into account when you're looking at the overall size of the market. Not only that, you also have to take a look at some other local areas that might not necessarily be a part of the metro, but might share enough people traveling back and forth, potential customers who either commute or spend a significant amount of time in nearby cities. One of the best examples of this is actually Baltimore and DC. They're different metro areas. They're technically different markets, but a lot of people from Baltimore drive into DC on a regular basis and vice versa. So while you can't necessarily add their populations together, it's a good thing to keep in mind when you're looking at market size that you will probably be punching a little above your weight there. Next important one to take a look at is median age. Like I said, the average craft beer drinker is relatively young, actually significantly relatively young. This is especially true of weekly craft beer drinkers who, dollar for dollar, are by far your most important customers. So finding out what the median age is in an area can give you a real good hint as to how kind of craft ready that market in particular might be. It's also important to keep in mind that median income. Now, this one is also hugely important, but it's not something that you can take out of context. So go back to that $100,000 number that I quoted before. $100,000 in New York City is going to mean something significantly different than $100,000 in Cheyenne, Wyoming, for example. So you have to be able to set and compare the cost of living versus the median income in any given market, just to make it useful and to make it meaningful for these purposes. But once you've done that, you'll find that certain places really do have more disposable income on average than others. Those are the places you want, because those are the places where people are going to have more money to spend on things like, craft beer dinners or an extra 6-pack or a $25 4-pack of slushy sour, because that's a thing. So these are the things that you need to really keep in mind when you're looking at the core craft consumer, the size of the market, and the size of the craft beer market within it. There are a couple other key market indicators. These next two are a little less strictly important, but still something to keep in mind, that 10-year population growth. Now, the reason this one's important, it's important for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, a city that is growing quickly has a tendency to also be relatively affluent and relatively young. People tend not to move to a place unless they're young enough to not have a ton weighing them down or tying them down. And they also tend to move to places where there's opportunity, typically financial or career opportunity. So by taking a look at 10-year population growth, you can further reinforce places that are likely to have more craft beer consumers as a ratio of the overall population. It also helps you avoid making bad bets in the long term. You do have places like Baltimore, which are hemorrhaging population over the last 10 years. So while some of the stats may make Baltimore look like a pretty good option, if you are planning for the future of your business, it's probably a good idea to at least be cognizant of the fact that those numbers will probably be shrinking as time goes forward, especially when comparing, apples to apples in two markets that might otherwise be very similar. And next up is tourism. Tourism, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody who's watching this right now. Tourism can be absolutely huge in the beer industry. Beer tourists, they love to travel. And they can contribute a lot to creating essentially a temporary population for places. You have certain markets like Virginia Beach that get an absolute influx of additional drinkers every summer. But two important things to keep in mind. First and foremost is when people are traveling, there's really two types of travelers. There are people who are traveling for beer and there are people who aren't. Now, people who aren't traveling for beer, they're actually the more likely consumer for you to pick up. but still relatively unlikely. At the end of the day, they have other things on their mind. If they're traveling to Virginia Beach, for example, yes, they might be buying beer, but the primary focus is on the beach or on the museums or on the attractions. Beer is just something they're consuming with dinner or that they just want to have on hand for while they're relaxing. It's not necessarily something that they are spending a whole lot of time on or a whole lot of money on. And that also becomes a bit of a points of distribution game. Rather than necessarily having a competitive edge or them really seeking out specific beers or in-demand beers. They're looking for something that's easy to grab and that they can take with them. The other type of tourist, beer tourists, you're almost never going to get your hands on. The issue there is that when people are traveling to a place because of beer, they want the beer that's there. So if in this Virginia Beach example, if people are going to Virginia Beach, chances are good they are going to be looking up the local breweries. They're going to be looking up the local beer. They might even be looking up a handful of the regionals, but by and large, they're not going to be looking up any sort of outside beer, no matter how good or how sexy it might be, unless it's something that they really, really just can't get at home. So for that percentage, sometimes tourism can wind up actually working against you. So it's an important thing to keep in mind, but know that the amount of tourists that come through an area is not one-to-one with population, and that it's more just something to keep in mind as an additional attraction. And those regional synergies are really the last key market indicator just to figure out how valuable a market is just keep taking into account things like how close the market is to your core market. If you are based, for example, in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Raleigh market might already be roughly familiar with your beer. If you're based in San Diego, then LA drinkers might at least have a top level knowledge of what you are offering. That can do a lot of the early work for you as far as just brand awareness and getting you into some of those early points of distribution. So it's something to keep in mind, but it's also important not to get too tied up into it. I've seen a lot of breweries that get so tied up into growing geographically outwards, almost in concentric circles. You know, where is the next place to fill out a circular distribution map? And sometimes you'll find there are some high value, really nice markets. For example, maybe you're doing the research and find out that Indianapolis, Indiana has everything you might be looking for in a market. And even though it might be a little further afield, it might be a lot more lucrative than the options that you have at hand that are closer to home. So don't restrict yourself from looking beyond. And you'll see a lot of the more successful and some of the more hyped up breweries of the last 10 years really noticing that and plopping down into some of these high value markets rather than necessarily trying to become a regional force. So as you're taking a look at these, you don't necessarily have to go ahead and plop these all into a spreadsheet with formulas and weighted averages and you know, get it all done so formally and make it look all clean and nice. But I did that. So go ahead and pull that up. But the important thing is to just make sure that you're able to compare and to contrast and to take a look at what these values look like against each other. Being able to take a look at the actual data and avoid making mistakes and avoid getting yourself too deep down a rabbit hole based on what are probably just assumptions rather than raw data. That's the goal here. So even if you're not going ahead and dropping this into a scorecard or dropping this into a spreadsheet, just make sure that you're spending the time to actually take a look at the numbers and let them speak to you. Now we've determined what the most valuable markets are. The next step is really to take a look at what your niche is. Now, this is something I harp on with my clients all the time. If you aren't able to describe what is unique and different about your brewery, then I can guarantee you that customers are not either. So it's important to really know thyself first and foremost before you even know what your value proposition is out to market. So the first thing that you really need to take a look at are your key brand differentiators. Now, right now, we just need to take a look at what are the things that are unique to the culture, to the brand, and to the product of your brewery. What makes you you? And get those down on paper. Those are going to be valuable time in and time out. It's the kind of thing that you should be able to recite off the top of your head and you should be able to come back to and really point to as this is who we are. But once you have those in hand and you figure out what makes us who we are, what are we doing well, and what really do we consider essential to our brand, you need to ask yourself the question. When a customer is perusing the shelves, when they're taking a look at all the brands available to them, why you? It's not just about what makes you different. It's about What are you offering that is valuable to them as a consumer? And more important than that, you need to make sure that that value proposition, what you are offering, that's getting communicated forward. If you're donating a portion of all of your proceeds to a wounded veterans charity, that's a wonderful thing, an incredible thing. But if a customer walking down the aisles isn't able to find that on your label, or if someone surfing on your Facebook page or website isn't able to find that, then from the standpoint of the consumer, it doesn't exist. Now, it doesn't mean it's not fantastic work or that you should be doing it for, the glory or what have you, but it does mean that you aren't bringing all of your tools to the table. That's something that the customers should know because it is awesome. And the same goes if you have a good story behind one of your beers or a unique process or unique ingredients, something that makes your beer, your brand, your product special. You have to make sure that you're communicating them out to your customers. Customers in general, they're lazy. And I can't even blame them. They have 1,000 things going through their head on any given day. They have kids to pick up from soccer practice. They have their work. They have to deal with their boss. They have to maintain, their relationships, their friendships. The last thing they need to do is have to work really hard to find out the things that really make your brand stand out and really tell the story of your product. So make sure that that value proposition is being communicated through every channel you have available, because that is how you stand out and that is how you really make your case to customers who otherwise may not know anything about your brand. Now we've established what are the most important markets for you to take a look at, and we've established what you are. But who's the competition in that market? Now, there's a couple of things that you really have to look at when it comes to the competition. And first and foremost is how many breweries are there in any individual market. And the reason this is important is twofold. First and foremost, it's just more volume of beer on the market. But second off, any of those beers that are local there, they are going to have a huge leg up on you. At the end of the day, any of the customers who are going to those brewery tap rooms are essentially lost potential value to you. They're customers you're never going to capture because they, by the very fact that they are in that brewery tap room, are almost assuredly going to be drinking products by that brewery. You don't really have a shot. Not only that, but the buyers at local retail locations, and actually even the staff working at your local wholesaler, they're probably going to those brewery tap rooms as well. That gives them, a little more of that intrinsic, intangible, good feelings about that particular brand. That's a hard thing to overcome unless you have some really compelling competitive advantage. Not only that, but some of the staff of those brewery tap rooms and of those breweries is probably going to these retail locations as well, which means that they can speak to their brand and they can ask where their brand is located. They can build those relationships every time they're in there. If you have only one brand rep in a market, and in a lot of cases, that's all you'll be able to have, if that, then that is a pretty significant disadvantage compared to the brewery that happens to be right up the street from them. It's also important to keep in mind the proportion of breweries to the population. Now, to give you another anecdotal example, the Charlotte, North Carolina area, bringing that back again, has, depending on where you draw the line, between about 60 and 70 breweries in the metro area. Decent amount, quite a few actually, but if you compare it to someplace like Portland, Oregon, not a crazy amount. And then if you look at Asheville, North Carolina, which I know a lot of people are familiar with, it's about two and a half hours west of here, often called the Napa Valley of beer. And it has about 60 breweries in its greater metro area. It'd be pretty easy to take a look at that and for somebody to make the assumption that these are roughly equivalently competitive local markets. Now, here's the difference. Remember how Charlotte has about 2.6 million people? Well, Asheville has a little under 500,000 in its metro area, and they're a lot more spread out. Not only that, but I think it has the highest per capita breweries in the entire country, I think after only Portland, Maine. So it's pretty crowded locally anyhow. So even the people who are there, and yes, they love beer and they drink an enormous amount of it, but they're not drinking your beer. They're drinking beer from the brewery down the street. And if not them, the brewery down the other street. And if not them, the brewery in the third street that's behind their house. And if not them, they're going to South Slope and they're drinking from all the guys down there. So you don't really have a chance as an outside brewery. There's no place for you and there isn't enough people to support you even if you wanted to. So the number of breweries and the proportion of that to the population, you have to take those into account together to really get a good idea of how saturated locally an individual market is. In addition to taking a look at the number of breweries, it's important to look at what you can offer that those local options cannot. Now, there may be only one brewery in town, but if you are a strictly Reinheitsgebot Bavarian-style brewery that specializes in German lagers, and so is the one other brewery in town, you're going to be in for a rough time. At the end of the day, they are filling that niche. They're filling that role. And not only that, but they have a leg up on you. They are local, and they've been there longer. It's going to be really hard for you to make the case to a consumer unless you're able to offer something else that they aren't, that you deserve a few of their dollars as well. So take a look at what those local breweries are offering. There are some niches that can support more than one. Hazy IPAs are a pretty popular example right now. Fruited sours are another popular one. Back in the day, West Coast IPAs, and still on the West Coast IPAs can be very, very successful, even if there's a lot of local saturation because the market for them is that large. But you have to ask yourself in any of these situations, why you? Why is the customer going to pick you versus anybody who happens to be there in town and speaking to them more often and more directly? You have to take into account that value proposition and what you can do to make sure that your beer is the one that they're pulling off the shelf. And not only do you have to be able to fill a role for a consumer, but you also have to be able to fill a role for a wholesaler. So wholesalers, they are your customers as well. They are buying beer from you. And when you are talking to them, you really have to take into account what position you have within their portfolio. In that earlier example, you need to take a look at what they are offering. And yes, there might not be a local Bavarian style brewery, but if the wholesaler that you're trying to get with already has one of those in their portfolio, then chances are good when they walk into a place and they're looking for a Pilsner, you're not going to be top of mind. They have that pre-existing relationship with the other brand. That other brand is a little more established in the area. They already have the beer in the warehouse. So you need to ask yourself what you're able to provide and what value you're able to bring to the table that other brewery is not. And this is always true for wholesalers. Always make sure that you're asking those guys, what role can we provide? What niche can we fill? What hole can we fill in your offerings? Because at the end of the day, every outside brewery for a wholesaler is a role player first and foremost. Now, if you are doing self-distro, that's not nearly as much of a problem. I would hope if you're doing self-distribution, your brand is the one that you're pushing the hardest. If it is not, I have some bigger concerns for your business model, but that's a bridge to cross when we talk down the road. The last thing you need to take a look at when taking a look at the competition are what additional resources you have, however, as far as giving you a competitive advantage. So these are things like, are you going to be able to provide a brand rep in the area? That can go a long way. Brand reps can be expensive, and honestly, the good ones are hard to come across. But when well-trained, well-compensated, and the right person in the right seat, they can be a huge asset because they're able to speak directly to your brand and they're able to be your spokesman on the ground. If you have that, that's something that helps make you stand out at least against the other outside breweries and can at least help build parity with some of those local offerings as well. Are you going to have a supporting tap room? Now, this one's a little different equation, but if you're planning on building a tap room in a new market, all of a sudden you are a local brand, and that can be a huge asset. At the end of the day, tap rooms, more even than revenue generators, they're marketing machines. They are the best tool that you have to get your product in front of people and make it so that when they go to Harris Teeter or Kroger's or ShopRite, that you're the one that they're pulling off the shelf. People like to buy from brands they're familiar with, even fickle craft beer consumers. So when you're able to give them that option with something like a tap room, it goes a long way. Additionally, if you have any relationships, things like relationships with a wholesaler or pre-existing relationships in the market, if you've had a lot of success at local beer festivals, been invited back quite a few times, those are all things to take into consideration as far as your ability to actually compete. I know that we like to pretend that this industry is all hugs and kisses and hunky-dory, and to a degree it really is, but it's also important to keep in mind that we are very competitive, and as this industry continues to fragment and continues to get tighter, and we continue to see further fragmentation in beverage alcohol in general, that you know the ways that you're going to stay relevant and you're going to stay important, particularly in markets that you might not have as long a history in. The last thing that you really have to keep in mind is barriers to entry. These are the additional things above and beyond the local competition, above and beyond what you have to offer, above and beyond just the size of the market that may make it more difficult for you to actually participate. These are things like, the actual wholesale restrictions within a state. If you're going out of state, you're probably, unless you also own a distributorship, which is only a handful of you, not going to be able to do any sort of effective self-distribution. So in that case, you're going to have to look at wholesalers, and you're going to have to make those inroads with those wholesalers and figure out who is the best fit for you. Some areas aren't going to have a wholesaler who either has room for you or is acceptable. So you need to figure that out ahead of time, because there's nothing worse than investing in market research and energy and starting to promote an area when you don't even know if you're going to be able to find a good partner to put your beer on shelves. In addition to that, if there's any sort of out-of-state licensing, it's cheap. Most states have it. It's usually an easy thing to do, but it is one more thing that you have to pay attention to and worry about. If it's your first time out of state, you also have to keep in mind any label approvals, TTB approvals that you have to get, which can take additional time. And it can really slow down your normal production cycle, especially if you have a lot of rotating products. There's also all of the costs of entry that you really have to do, and any new market's going to have some of these, whether it's new staffing for sales and brand staffing, or if you have to hire new drivers if you're doing self-distribution. That's important. If you're having to up production in order to meet the demand in this new market, that's also something you have to take into account when it comes to your labor and staffing issues, or at least the costs associated with them. Are you going to need new merchandise, or at least more expansive merchandise? Are you going to need to give some of that away, whether through online sweepstakes or at the point of sale? Are you going to need to purchase placements or additional incentives with any of your wholesalers? These are all things that can really start to add up very quick, and far too many breweries don't consider them until they get there and start having some of those hard conversations with a wholesaler who they don't have a relationship with yet, because the relationship is new. So make sure you're taking all those into account, because there's nothing worse than getting into a new market and realizing that you are actually losing money on every case of beer you sell. So make sure that you're doing some of those calculations ahead of time and weighing those against all of the other factors towards figuring out if this market is really the right fit for you. Because that does create an opportunity cost. If there are other markets that you would be able to sell maybe a little less beer, but are going to cost you a lot less and assorted additional costs in order to do business in, that has to play a role in balancing the scales on which one you decide to go with. And last but not least, just make sure those, again, I cannot reiterate, you have to take a good look at wholesalers and take a look at where you fit in their portfolio. You are always going to be a role player for most of these wholesalers, and you need to make sure that when they walk into a particular retailer, that you're top of mind for them in that particular role. So if you are going to be fighting for space, if you are a hazy IPA brewery and they have 10 others in their portfolio, why do you think that their rep on the ground is going to be mentioning you first when they know that they have an account looking for one? If you're doing a lot of big barrel-aged imperial stouts, but they're also carrying Founders and Rare Barrel and a whole bunch of other big barrel-aged breweries that put a big focus on the barrel program, what do you really have to offer that's going to make you stand out comparatively? You have to take those into account, because a lot of times wholesalers are still figuring out this whole craft beer thing, even 20, 30 years into it, and still figuring out how to balance their portfolios. They're getting better at it. And oddly, for suppliers, that makes it a little tougher for you guys to get in with them. But it's a question that you need to ask up front, because with franchise agreements being the way that they are in so many states, that could wind up with your beer sitting on a shelf instead of sitting at home in someone's fridge. The most important thing to keep in mind when you're entering any new market or considering any new market is just make sure that you're doing your homework. Make sure that you are considering the size of what that market is. Far too often I see people looking at markets as, well, I have to go here. I have to fill out this state. And you really don't. At the end of the day, the only markets worth going into are the ones that are going to make you money. That's what this is. And your business needs to be treated as such to really do justice by yourself and by your employees. So take the time, sit down, and put that effort in. And if you're having trouble with it, reach out to me. reach out to somebody who's willing to put that time in, is willing to work for you, and willing to help you out with that. I think we're going to go ahead and open it up to a few questions now, if anybody has any. Andrew, I know you're lurking in the background there as well. So talking a little more about market viability, how expansive you make your hunt can vary significantly based on what your needs are. You don't necessarily have to plaster the entire country as you're looking. A lot of times it's just the ones that make the most sense to you are going to be rather intuitive. And you owe it to yourself to look at some of those real big markets like Chicago or New York before you really start venturing into any sort of discussion on where to go next. But you don't necessarily have to start looking at San Diego if you're based in Virginia. You don't necessarily have to start looking at Boston if you're based in Oregon. But you should be doing your homework on your region and taking a look at some of those kind of key cities and seeing where it makes the most sense. You also want to make sure that you have enough product to supply. Now, this is one I've seen a lot of breweries run into almost by accident. Enter a new market, and sometimes that demand will wind up outpacing what they had projected for. And they wind up running into constraints either on their system or on their just the labor and ability to turn that over. And sometimes that's even triggered by the home market. Things just start going really well at home, and you have to make a decision on where that product is going. The issue with that is if you start running into out of stocks, there is almost no quicker way to lose the trust of a wholesaler, and especially almost no quicker way to lose the trust of any of your large volume retailers. So things like Total Wine, things like any of the grocery store accounts, the moment they start running into out of stocks, you go from out of stock for a week to out of stock forever. They don't want to play with any of that. And the next time that they're doing sets, you'll be the first one out the door. So make sure that you can support any new markets that you go into. Otherwise, what you're running into is you're essentially stretching yourself, your brand, and your product thin without being able to necessarily provide the support. And that support's not just in product either. You have to make sure that you are throwing your full weight behind any market you go into. One other big mistake I've seen a lot of breweries run into as they are expanding outward, they enter new markets and really push hard for about a week and a half. And that's the last you'll ever hear of them. They have no rep in the area, which, okay, but they're not sending any new product there, not making an effort. They're not doing what they can to support it. And as a result, they wind up kind of languishing on the shelves and just fading away. Now, that's not only lost opportunity, and it's not only a waste of time, it can also lead to this situation where you've essentially closed that market off to yourself going forward because you've lost consumer trust, you've lost wholesaler trust, retailer trust. You have to be willing to support those markets. Otherwise, you might find yourself chasing a new market here, a new market there, a new market there, a new market there every few months, just trying to keep your inflated growth levels up and try to essentially chase the dragon. And that can wind up biting you in the ass when you reach the point where there are no more easy markets. And now it's costing you a little more. And it's costing you a bit to maintain those markets you're already in. And it's just costing you in product. It's costing you in time. It's costing you in energy, labor costs, and can wind up being the death of a handful of breweries, or at least a huge impediment to a handful of breweries that otherwise were doing pretty well. It's called the green flash problem. I've called it a couple of times. And last thing you want to do is find yourself in a similar situation. All right. So going back a little on the slideshow. Hope if I did it right. All right. Okay. All right. So key metrics. So yeah. So as far as what methods I think are the best for getting data on an area, probably the most straightforward is to go ahead and just do a Google search. Most of those key metrics are really easy to find. Medium population levels, that's Wikipedia, or even a basic Google search will get you it. Things like median income and median age, you got to dig a little more, but again, Google's the best way to go. If you are looking to do additional data gathering, however, there's a few means that you can do. First and foremost, not everybody can actually afford to go to all of these markets, especially if you're considering from among 5 or 6 of them. So don't necessarily feel like you have to be in each of these areas, but reach out to people who are in the area. Take a look, for example, of what breweries are moving a lot of product. If you do have any relationships with wholesalers in the area, for example, wholesalers who have multiple markets and you have that pre-existing relationship with, ask them what they're seeing. Ask them what is really moving, and ask them what they are really seeing out of customers and seeing out of the market. It never hurts to reach out to top retailers either. They have a million things on their mind and might not be able to get back to you in timely fashion. But if you got a place like, the Porter, or here in the Charlotte area, Salud, just go ahead and reach out and see if they're, or take a look at their draft menu and see what they're picking up, because sometimes that can give you an indication, kind of a finger on the pulse of things. Aside from that, reach out to the thought leaders and local influencers. This can be just, local beer writers, whether that's Brew Public up in the Pacific Northwest, or, it's Beer Chronicle down in Houston, Beer Charlotte here in the Charlotte area. Just go ahead and reach out to the people behind that and ask them what they're seeing. Usually, if anything, you have a hard time getting them to shut up about beer. So the data gathering is pretty straightforward and pretty easy. And the riskiest approach is talk to people who have either worked at those breweries or talk to the brewery owners in an area. They're wealth of information because they're the people who are living it every day. The problem is they could be doing, counterintelligence, so to speak. So you have to keep in mind that those same people might be trying to get information out of you about whether it's your plans in the market or what they can do in your market. So before you go setting yourself up in that way, just make sure that you're exhausting all other data streams first and foremost. All right. Any other questions? Take a look for a second at, again, this is an example of what a pretty straightforward spreadsheet would look like if you decide to drop some of this information in there. Creating this whole thing, and this is just an example, not all these numbers are 100% accurate, but creating this whole thing took maybe 3 or 4 hours, and given the scale and the breadth of what I was looking at, essentially the entire Southeast, that's not that much time, given how much information, how much data I get out of it. Not only that, but it also gives you the opportunity to compare things side by side and reorder things if there's a particular value that you think is especially important. And again, for most of you, you're not looking amongst 40 cities. You're looking at 5 or 6. So just being able to set them up, take a look, you're looking at maybe a solid 45 minutes worth of work. And for something that could determine, the bottom line for your brewery by 10 or 20% for the next year, you owe it to yourself to at least spend the time taking a look and seeing if you can really make those determinations on your end. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that if you are trying to weight these things against each other, population numbers are obviously a lot higher than age or income. So one thing that's useful to do is measure them against the median. So find the median of all the median population and then find how much the individual cities deviate, whether higher or lower than the median. Do the same thing for age, same thing for income. And as long as you're not weighting it, that can give you a good comparison point between those cities' data sets. Versus if you were just doing a straight comparison of the raw numbers, just additive, in which case that population is going to account for 99.9% of the total. Tourism data is another one that you can usually find online. That's probably the hardest one to look up, but it's also one of the least important for craft beer purposes. So if you're not able to find that, don't sweat it too much. most departments of tourism will at least have the number somewhere, but you'll have to do a little digging. But those 10-year population growth is really easy to find. Cost of living is usually pretty easy to find as well. And also might surprise you. You might find yourself living in a very expensive city. And if there's one thing that COVID has taught us, it's that working from home can be a wonderful thing. All right. Da 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 da. Oh, so also upcoming, keep an eye out for me at the fall conference that Andrew and Craft Beer Professionals is going to be running here in a couple of weeks. On there, I will be speaking on the panel on distribution, the current state of distribution, as well as doing a further presentation on integrating beer education into your staff training. Two very important things. Wholesalers especially tend to get a bad rap in the craft beer industry. Some of it deserved, some of it not. But at the end of the day, for many of us, they are partners, and we all want the same thing, which is to move as much beer as possible. So definitely tune into that. Both of those, actually. Other things that I have coming up on my end, if you would like to reach out, I'll go ahead and put my contact info back up on the screen. And you can find me pretty much all over the place. Technically, what I do for a living is I help breweries sell their product more efficiently, more effectively, and more strategically is my tagline. But honestly, what I do is just a little bit of everything. If it touches the craft beer industry, I'm happy to help you with it. You can find me online at www.freshpitchconsulting.com. You can also find me at Fresh Pitch Consulting on Facebook and Instagram. I will warn you in advance, I'm terrible at updating my Instagram, which is funny because I'm usually pretty good at updating my clients' Instagram. Also on Twitter at fresh_pitch. And I'm also a contributor on a couple of things online as well, just because I totally needed more to do with my day. So you can check me on YouTube or here on Facebook on the Beer With Me Network. I have a series of shows that I'm a contributor to on there. And I am the lead writer at beercharlotte.com, covering the greater Charlotte area and all the brews and brews news that's taking place in this area. Try to stay as connected as possible. All right, so did get a question on the private stream. Any up and coming markets that I believe have room for growth? Yeah, the American Southeast has a ton of room for growth. One of the big ones I think is underserved is Atlanta. Again, that metro area is absolutely massive. It is one of the largest metro areas in the country. It is still a relatively young city. And yeah, there's not nearly enough breweries to support that general market, which is one of the reasons why the ones that are there are really kind of exploding. So I'd say Atlanta is a huge one. The Raleigh-Durham market, also in the Southeast, is another one. They have a very good local scene, but they don't have a particularly local, locavore group of consumers. People in Raleigh-Durham tend to drink just about anything. So if you're an outside brewery, you'll have a better chance than you will in similarly sized cities. Aside from that, get into Florida while you can. Florida is starting to go crazy about craft beer, but the breweries are starting to pop up equally fast. So if you're going to get in there, you need to be in there basically yesterday. And aside from that, any area where you're starting to see the marijuana industry take off is probably going to be a no-go. We haven't started to see the full effects of the cannabis industry on the craft beverage industry yet, but places like Denver, places like, Colorado in general, places like Oregon, there are other factors that are also very much at play, but cannabis is definitely providing a bit of a ceiling on that, and especially with the beverage industry further fragmenting, your energies are probably best spent elsewhere. Also, don't be afraid to look at some of the cities that might not be quite as large, but are also very underserved. Place like Louisville, Kentucky. I mean, it's got plenty of cities that are in kind of a circle around it, so you can draw from additional markets. It has a good-sized population. It has a relatively young population and very, very little local competition, especially local competition of note. You definitely have places like, Mile Wide, places like Against the Grain, but, little places like that are definitely worth your time and worth seeking out, places like Cincinnati. Actually, just the Cincinnati scene in general is fantastic. So heading up there probably in December. So if anybody has any good brewery recommendations, let me know. And aside from that, just keep in mind that growth has to be sustainable. It's not just about growing, and it's not just about growing as fast as you can. Again, that green flash problem, I cannot reiterate enough. That is essentially a bubble in the traditional sense. As it grows, it becomes harder and harder to sustain. And unless you are making sure that you're reinvesting in those areas, you are potentially going to run into some very big issues down the line as you basically paint yourself into a corner of underserved markets. It is not as much of an issue anymore. I think there's been enough illustrative examples. A lot of breweries are kind of catching on that's a dangerous path to go down. But invest in your sales teams, invest in your sales efforts. I've done a series of presentations on why those are important. At the end of the day, that's your outward face to the community, and a well invested in sales team that is well trained and held accountable is basically what built the industry. If you talk to the founders of the Boston Beer Company, you talk to the founders of Magic Hat, you talk to the founders of Sierra Nevada, any of them have said and will continue to say that investing in your sales team, investing in your sales efforts, and investing in making sure that you have a place in your markets is absolutely essential for long-term sustained growth. At this point, I'm happy to answer questions about anything, so shoot. Well, all right, guys. Hoping you guys enjoyed the presentation. I know it's a little bit of a quieter crowd today, and this isn't exactly the content that's going to inspire a whole lot of people. I hope it inspires work out of you. I hope it inspires efforts and inspires you to start thinking about growth a little differently. But I also understand that's not nearly as much fun as talking about the new barrel-aged offering. So I appreciate you tuning in regardless, guys. And yeah, I hope you have an excellent day and drink some fantastic beer. I know I'll see you guys around. Cheers.